and welcome to Chapter 6 of A History of Spain, entitled Iberians, Warriors, Words and Wonders. I'm David Beeson. In this episode, we're going to introduce the concept of Orientalization, which is the influence exerted on people of the Western Mediterranean by cultures from the East, above all the Phoenicians, but also the Greeks. We're going to focus in particular on the peoples of the eastern seaboard of Iberia, and we're going to see that Orientalization produced some pretty remarkable art there, but sadly wasn't able to prevent some pretty brutal violence. I feel I owe you an apology for not having produced an episode last week. This was because it took rather longer to prepare this week's episode and next week's than I'd expected. Those two episodes are going to give Ghostbusters a bit of a run for its money because we're going to turn into the equivalent in history and become Mythbusters. This week's myth is that prehistoric peoples lived in neatly bounded regions with good solid borders, rather like modern states. That's the impression you might get from looking at a traditional map of prehistoric times. The reality is that people lived in open territories with porous boundaries across which they moved for trade or even to intermarry. A much more sensible kind of map would show people in spread out areas thinning towards the edges and overlapping with the areas next door. Well, we're going to start this week by stepping back again a few centuries to 1300 BCE. Now, I hope that's not too irritating. I know I find it a little frustrating in TV series or novels when there are sudden flashbacks. You know, I've just got into the story of the characters in 2015 when I hit a chapter titled 1945. And I realise I'm going to have to tear my attention away from them and instead focus on their great-grandparents. Still, it seems very much the fashion in TV series and novels, so perhaps there's no harm in my doing a bit of it here. Now, of the peoples back then, we're not going to spend time looking at the Alentasian Late Bronze or indeed at West Andalusian. That's because they're the people who would turn into Tartessos in a few centuries' time, and we spent quite long enough on them last week. So let's come round the corner to the Mediterranean coast and look at the people I've marked on the map as post-Agar and Bronze of Levante. You'll remember from episode 2 that Indo-European DNA had spread across the whole of Iberia. But these were regions which, culturally at least, had remained predominantly pre-Indo-European. It seems fairly clearly established that they spoke not one but several pre-Indo-European languages. The people of the southern, post-Agar part of the region were the successors of the Argaric culture. Now, were these the kin of the ones who would become the Tartessians? That's a question that has yet to be decided. We don't really know what language they spoke in Tartessos. There are even people who think it might have been a form of Celtic. More archaeologists seem to believe that it was pre-Indo-European, though whether it was closely related to the pre-Indo-European of the East Coast, we still don't know. In the early first millennium BCE, these people came under significant influence from the Phoenicians, who traded along the Mediterranean seaboard, just as they traded along the Atlantic coast to the south. That's where Tartessos would emerge. At about the same time as the Phoenicians, a new influence started to appear in the north of the region, this time from a cultural wave of Indo-Europeans that was sweeping across Europe. That's something I'll talk about in more detail in our next episode. Out of all this, there began to emerge a new culture on the eastern seaboard from around 700 BCE. These are the people we call the Iberians. That may seem confusing since the word Iberian also applies to the whole of the peninsula, but to be fair, it was applied to the people first and extended to the peninsula later. It was the Greeks that gave them that name. They'd been extending their reach across the Mediterranean just like the Phoenicians, and they had founded a great trading colony in Massalia, now Marseille in France. From there they pressed on towards Iberia, where they founded another colony at what they called Emporion, now known as Empúries in Catalonia. The aim of the colony is pretty clear since Emporion actually means trading centre. Think of the word emporium today. They reached Iberia in about 600 BCE and launched Emporion in around 575. They named the people of the region after the major river there. It was called the Iberus or Iber, which is a word from a pre-Indo-European language used in various versions for several rivers in Europe. It probably just means river. If you think calling a river river is pretty unimaginative, I'm afraid you've just put your finger on something fairly common when it comes to human naming of places. Don't forget that the people from Tyre, which they presumably thought of as their old city, called the colony they founded in North Africa Carthage, which only means new city in Phoenician. There are 4 rivers in England and 2 in Scotland that are all called Avon, which comes from the Celtic word abona, meaning, you guessed it, river. Well, the particular river which produced a name for the Iberians is now known as the Ebro. It flows right across northern Iberia from the Cantabrian Mountains on the Bay of Biscay right down to a great delta through which it flows into the Mediterranean. It's likely that it was Greek sailors that came up with the name Iberia for the region around what is now the River Ebro. There's a story, possibly a fable, about Phoenician sailors also giving the region a name. They were struck by the fact that there were lots of rabbits there. Now, they didn't actually recognize the rabbits as such because there were none in Phoenicia. Instead, they thought that they were examples of an animal of which there were many in their part of the world, the hyrax. And they decided to call the place the island or coast of the hyrax. In their language, that's I Shepanim, and I apologize to any Phoenician speakers for my accent. You can imagine that turning into Hispanim, and from there into Latin Hispania. That would later evolve into modern España. And I particularly like the irony that the Phoenicians didn't actually use that name. They preferred the Greek one and called the peninsula Iberia. It was the Romans who called the peninsula Hispania, so it was them that adopted the name, which had its roots in Phoenician, if we believe the tale. A link back to that Phoenician sailor story was provided by the coins the Romans eventually struck for their Iberian provinces. The coins show a reclining woman representing Hispania, and at her feet an animal. Experts tell me that it's a rabbit. I have to admit that looking at the coins, I find it difficult to identify the animal as a rabbit, but if the experts say it is, who am I to question their judgment? Well, so much for how the Iberians got their name. It's time to move on now to the much more interesting subject of who they were and what they did. Let's start by saying that they were, of course, open to exactly the same influence from the Mediterranean as their contemporaries in Tartessos. Phoenician traders were trading all along the Mediterranean seaboard just as they were along the southern Atlantic coast. I've already mentioned that they were also in contact with the Greeks that had set up their own colony in Emporion, up in the north of the Iberian region. That means that as well as agriculture, trade was a pretty key part of the Iberian economy. But then there was something else that was pretty striking, which is that they tended to build their towns as hill forts with strong defensive walls and with well-planned and carefully laid out streets. Remains of settlements of that kind are scattered all over the Iberian region, right up into places like Ullastret in what is now Catalonia. What struck me most when I first learned about this approach, however, was how similar it was to what we saw in early episodes was done in Los Miares and the Argaric culture, both of which had emerged in the southern end of the region. That's surprising because Los Miares had collapsed a millennium and a half earlier, and even the Argaric culture had gone 5 centuries before. You may remember from episode 5 that the people of Tartessos tended to live in more open settlements, not on hilltops, and with less of an eye to defence. Now, it's not as though the Iberians could have consulted any written records, since there weren't any, and a long time had passed since the collapse of the Argaric culture, let alone Los Miares, so it's very unlikely that the Iberians knew much about either of them. At most, they may have seen the remains of their settlements, which were indeed up on the top of hilltops and well defended. That may perhaps have given them something of a model to follow. It's more likely that the main driver for the similarity between what the Iberians did and what Los Miares and El Argar had done is that in the southern part of the Iberian region at least, they were in the same semi-arid environment of the southeast of the peninsula. That tends to make people feel that a surplus of food is something that badly needs to be protected, and in a trading society, which the Iberians were, they may well have had other forms of wealth, jewellery, fine metalwork, great ceramics, whatever, which they may also have felt other people were after and needed defending. Tartessos, on the other hand, was built around rivers, and that creates an environment of other conditions and other pressures, and perhaps helps explain why their settlements were so different. Of course, not every society living in semi-arid conditions goes for hilltop towns and defensive fortifications. It is possible that the Iberians maintained a tradition of going for that kind of location and that kind of building. After all, think back to when we were talking about the Yoma de Bechi. That was a simple farmstead with no military role at all, but it was built with heavy stone walls and on a hilltop. It's as though somehow the general culture was that it's a good idea to be up high and well protected by solid walls. Now there's one particularly striking site of the Iberian culture at La Bastida de les Alcuses in the province of Valencia, whose destiny really underlines how sensible it was to make defence a priority. Though in its case, sadly, it didn't go anything like far enough. La Bastida de les Alcuses dates from the 4th century BCE, so quite late in the period that we're looking at, well into the Iron Age. It was sacked and abandoned in about 330 BCE, so it was only inhabited for 3 or 4 generations. We know that it was sacked because belongings had been found in the street and weapons, and a couple of the gates were blocked, and there's signs of fire. We can't be certain why La Bastida was destroyed. Archaeologists usually suggest 2 main possibilities. One is that the arable land around was highly desirable and desired by people who felt that it would be much better if it were owned by them than by the people of La Bastida. The other possible motive is that it lay across a trading route into the central plateau of Spain, the Meseta, And La Bastida's competitors might well not have wanted to leave them in a location which gave them such control over it. As it happens, a great deal has survived the destruction of life at La Bastida de les Alcuces. There are houses of different sizes, which suggest that the society there was highly stratified, with different levels of wealth and presumably different levels of power. Archaeologists have found a lead plaque with an inscription on it, as well as showing the obvious, which is that the Iberians had a writing system. It also confirms that the writing system is not the same as that used around the corner in Tartessos, rather underlining the notion that the two languages, whether or not they were related, were probably not the same. What it has in common with Tartessian is that we don't know it, and there's hardly anything in it that we can translate. This and other inscriptions found around the Iberian region do rather suggest that the language was pre-Indo-European, and it seems that the alphabet included characters representing syllables as well as others representing individual sounds. Otherwise, it's all a bit of a mystery, just like Tartessian. When it comes to defending a town, it's not enough just to have fortifications. You also need men, and it would have been mostly men, with arms to defend them. There's evidence that among Iberians in general, and in particular in the Bastida de les Alcuces, a warrior culture was beginning to develop. One of the other objects found at the Bastida is rather a fine figurine of a warrior on horseback. It's called the Warrior of Moixent, and it reveals both an admiration for armed men and a capacity for remarkable art. As it happens, the production of some outstanding art is one of the hallmarks of the Iberians generally. Their connections with the Phoenicians had a major effect on them, just as it did in Tartessos. Nothing makes that clearer than what's probably the best-known piece of Iberian art from that period. If you drive from where we live outside Valencia into the city, you go past a colossal and extraordinary monument. It's called the Dama Iberica, the Iberian Lady, and it's made up of 22,000 pieces of glass, each of which is a replica miniature of the whole monument. That takes the form of a stylized human head with a kind of circular structure on either side of it. It's coloured the blue of the roof tiles of many historic buildings in Valencia. Foreigners living here have come up with a number of irreverent names for it. One I know calls it the earphones. Even I, when I first saw it, thought it might be a tribute to Princess Leia from Star Wars, which maybe gives you an idea of what it looks like. In reality, it's a tribute to a remarkable Iberian statue, the bust and head of a woman. The circular structures on either side of the head are meant to be hair that's been rolled into two buns and held in place by jewellery. It's a particularly striking piece of sculpture, and it reflects the preoccupation of the Greek aesthetic, which was very much the rage at the time, which pursued an ideal vision of beauty in its art, including in sculpture. Now, it's possible that the sculptor of that Iberian piece received that Greek influence directly, but it's also possible that it came via the Phoenicians. You may remember that back in episode 4 I mentioned a bowl held by the British Museum in London, which, though made by Phoenicians, is decorated with Egyptian designs. It's clear that the Phoenicians were more than happy to borrow artistic ideas and forms from the many people that they met in the course of following their trading routes around the Mediterranean. It's perfectly possible that they communicated Greek ideas to the Iberians they traded with. This process of assimilating influences from the Eastern Mediterranean, whether from the Phoenicians, the Greeks, or the Greeks via the Phoenicians, is something the archaeologists call Orientalization. It's clear that the Iberians were just as profoundly affected by it as their contemporaries in Tartessos. It may have started in trade, but it soon extended to other areas too, and this sculpture is an excellent example of how it moulded art and culture. Because the statue was found in the little town of Elche, south of Valencia, and a little way to the north of Murcia, it's called the Dama de Elche, the Lady of Elche. There's a copy still in the museum at Elche, although the original, unsurprisingly, is now in the National Archaeological Museum of Spain in Madrid. The statue as we now have it is plain stone, and I find it quite attractive enough as it is. Archaeologists, however, believe that it started off painted in various colours, and they've come up with a reconstitution of how it might originally have looked, with its bright reds and golds and blues and so forth. Personally, I'd settle with complete satisfaction for the stone version, but either way, it's certainly an impressive work of art. Now, as I've been emphasising throughout this episode, none of these cultures were isolated. None of them stood apart from the others. I was talking only a few minutes ago about the fact that one of the reasons that the Bastida de les Alcuces was sacked might have been because it was on a trading route into the central meseta of Spain. That was the region referred to by archaeologists as Cogotas, and it was predominantly Indo-European. It's clear, though, that there was trade between the Iberian peoples and the peoples of the meseta, and no doubt also intermarriage. But as I pointed out earlier on in this episode, the people of Cogotas were by no means the only Indo-Europeans with whom the Iberians would be in contact in the first millennium BCE. I suppose that as Iberia is in the far west of Europe, it's not at all surprising that most of the external influences on it came from the east. After all, we've been dealing with influences from the Phoenicians and Greeks in this episode. We saw before how the Neolithic farmers came from Anatolia and how the Indo-European speakers arrived from descendants of the Yamnaya people of the Eurasian steppes in what is now Ukraine and Russia. I started this episode with a flashback that I hope you didn't find too exasperating, to 1300 BCE. Within a century of that time, things began stirring in the east again. This was the emergence of what we now call the Urnfield people, and they'd be the start of 3 waves that would come sweeping across Europe right up to Iberia. But all of that had an impact far too big to start dealing with it at the end of an episode. Instead, we'll come back to the Indo-Europeans in Spain next week. That's both the Indo-Europeans who were already settled there in the central meseta or in the north and west, and the new arrivals, and above all the new influences from the east. And of course, we can look forward to another instalment of myth busting. Until then, thanks for listening and have a good week.